The glow-up she didn't see coming. I left with no intention of looking back. The move wasn't about running, it was about removing any chance of crossing paths with her again. I packed what I needed, which turned out to be less than I expected, and headed clear across the country. A friend let me crash for a while as I figured out what came next. That's when an old buddy I trusted pitched me on a small business he'd been piecing together. It wasn't flashy, but he'd already built a foundation, and he thought with the right push it could become something real. I had some savings, and after everything I'd left behind, the idea of pouring my energy into work felt like a relief. It was a grind. The early stretch meant long hours with nothing guaranteed at the end. My life pared down to simple routines: show up, do the work, go home, repeat. But the effort started to pay off. We got our first steady client, then another, and before long there was enough momentum to keep the lights on without constant panic. No windfalls, just slow, steady growth and the sense that we'd hit the right place at the right time. After a couple of years, that steady climb turned into a real opportunity. A bigger company in our field reached out. They wanted what we'd built: brand, clients, all of it, and their offer came with one condition: we'd step out completely. The number they named made the decision quick. One signature turned years of effort into more money than I had ever imagined having at once. I didn't blow it. I upgraded my place, cleared out my debts, and put the rest into making sure I wouldn't have to live paycheck to paycheck again. I didn't tell her any of it, not because I was plotting revenge, but because there was no point. I didn't want her opinion, her interference, or any chance for her to insert herself back into my life. The cleanest way to keep it that way was to keep my personal and financial life closed off from her view entirely. As far as she knew, I could have been working a modest job and just getting by. Letting her believe that was easier than inviting questions. News about her still drifted in through people I trusted. She was playing up her new relationship like it was a prize she'd won. Photos from trips financed on borrowed money, updates with carefully crafted smiles, little digs that read like they were meant for me without ever saying my name. It wasn't hard to see the performance. I stayed quiet. No social media counterpoints, no "look at me now" posts. If a mutual asked how I was doing better than before was all they got. I knew eventually she'd piece together fragments, overheard mentions about a nicer apartment, someone saying I traveled more, little clues that I wasn't exactly scraping by. The longer the gap between those hints and the last she knew of my life, the more it meant she'd have to sit with the fact that she was fully on the outside now. The money was good, but the real turning point was what came with it: time. I didn't have her drama in my orbit anymore. I didn't have to think about managing someone else's messes or defending my decisions. I built my days entirely on my own terms. The contrast was sharp. I'd gone from ending nights on a couch crowded with someone I never wanted there to waking up in a place that was mine alone, in a life that answered only to me. And with time, her opinion lost all weight. Early on, I still cared whether she looked down on me, still thought about proving her wrong. But when you've put enough distance between yourself and the person you used to be with, the scoreboard stops mattering. Even if she did find out what I'd built and what I'd earned, it wouldn't change my life in the slightest. I was already living it. Still, there was an unavoidable irony in her projecting a story of trading up while I quietly moved far past where she'd ever pictured me. It was like she was holding on to a competition I'd long since stopped entering, never realizing I'd been running a different race entirely. If she had known, I can imagine the reaction, masking surprise under a strained "good for him," maybe scrambling to downplay it. And at some point, realizing that dragging her feet on the divorce had done nothing for her, but imagining it was as close as it got. The reality stayed mine, and I preferred to keep it that way. Living well without making it a performance is simpler. No need to correct lies, no need to broadcast wins. The satisfaction isn't in anyone's reaction, it's in the life itself. She could keep whatever version of the story made her feel better. The truth didn't need to leave my circle. By the time the dust settled from the sale and I found work I'd actually wanted to do, she was still posting an edited version of her reality. From the outside, I figured she thought she'd left behind someone unremarkable, but the gap between her image of me and the actual life I was living had grown wide. Quietly, that gap might have been the most satisfying part. And just when I thought I'd set my trajectory exactly where I wanted it, something unexpected came along. Not a career move, not anything planned. The kind of turn you never see coming, the kind that resets the board overnight. Life's left hook. It started on a regular afternoon, nothing unusual, nothing memorable. I was driving home, thinking about dinner and loosely mapping out the week ahead. Traffic was light. I stopped at an intersection, waiting for the light to change, and that's when it hit, literally. Screeching tires, then a sudden violent impact from behind that knocked every thought out of my head. An 18-year-old, eyes glued to their phone instead of the road, hadn't braked until it was too late. One moment I was sitting still, the next I was slammed forward so hard my chest and neck lit up with pain. The first few minutes after were a blur. Horns blaring, people yelling outside the car, someone telling me to stay still. My hands shook, my left leg felt wrong, unresponsive, heavy, and my neck burned. The ambulance ride was short, but the emergency room brought answers I didn't want. Multiple fractures, a badly damaged knee, and nerve issues they warned could linger for a long time. That night was the last time I walked without thinking about what might give out underneath me. Recovery became my full-time job. Physical therapy multiple days a week. Follow-up appointments stacked on my calendar. Even a trip to the grocery store turned into a calculated effort. What made it worse was recognizing how much of my work depended on my body. My job at the time meant long hours on my feet, constant movement, and travel between sites. Standing for too long left me wincing. Stairs were brutal. My knee alone was enough to sideline me, but combined with the other injuries, the idea of going back to that role just wasn't realistic. When my medical leave ran out, so did the job. HR was clear they couldn't keep the position open forever. It stung, not just the loss of income, but the derailment of what I thought was the next solid phase of my career. Years of effort gone with one bad impact at a red light. While I was rebuilding what strength I could, my lawyer handled the other side of it. The driver's insurance company tried the usual lowball offers, quick settlements to make the claim disappear. I had no intention of rushing into that. We put everything in front of them: medical reports, physical therapy notes, the list of things I could no longer do, even projections on how much income I'd permanently lose by being pushed out of the line of work I'd trained for. This wasn't a payment for inconvenience. It was compensation for real, documented damage, medical bills past and future, lost earnings, and the permanent loss of physical ability. The process dragged over a year from the crash to the final number, but when the offer came, it changed things completely. It was more than I'd imagined, enough to pay off every bit of debt, buy a home without a mortgage, and still set aside savings so I didn't have to worry about how I'd cover my bills while figuring out my next move. I remember sitting in my lawyer's office, hearing the figure, and feeling both relief and something harder to name. I'd gained stability, but it was stability built on a loss I'd undo in a second if I could. Friends called it lucky, but there's nothing lucky about the kind of settlement that big. The amount was directly tied to how badly my life had been altered. It was calculated against years I'd never get back in my chosen work, procedures I'd need, and the reality that my body would never be exactly the same again. The check didn't undo any of that, it just made living with it less precarious. That financial security became a new kind of safety net. No more living month to month, no more wondering if one unexpected bill would wipe me out. For the first time, I had breathing room to think beyond just keeping the lights on. I could take my time deciding what I actually wanted to do, instead of scrambling for the first paycheck that came my way. The breathing room wasn't just about money, though. It gave me space to slow down and let my body heal without rushing. I could plan my days around what I could actually manage physically instead of pushing myself into further injury. I could look further down the road and ask questions I'd never had the spine or the means to ask before about what I wanted my life to actually look like. It also shifted the ground under one part of my life I hadn't thought much about: my legal connection to someone I hadn't been with in years. In my state, settlements like this aren't considered marital property. They're separate, untouchable in a divorce. So while I hadn't gone into this thinking about her and my focus was completely on my recovery, the fact remained: legally she couldn't claim a cent of it. I didn't tell her about the accident, about the settlement, or about what it allowed me to do. Keeping it within a small circle wasn't about secrecy for the sake of it, it was about protecting the peace I'd finally found. The fewer people who knew, the fewer conversations I'd have to fend off where someone suggested what I should do with it. The accident had stripped me of a career and left me with a body that needed constant negotiation to get through a day. But it had also left me in a position where, for the first time in my life, I no longer had to choose every move based on survival. I could lay out my future with some margin for error, knowing I wouldn't lose everything over one bad break. It wasn't an outcome I'd ever want to chase, but it was the one I had, and I knew how to make it work. That shift in my own life might have been the most dramatic thing I had going at the time, until I learned how dramatically the other end of the old story had changed. Word didn't come to me directly, and it wasn't something I'd gone looking for, but when it showed up, it was impossible not to notice the timing. And from there, the past had a way of inserting itself back into the present. Her karma delivery. The first I heard about her came in one of those sideways conversations where someone who loosely keeps tabs on old connections drops a name without thinking much of it. There wasn't any malice in the way they told me. Still, the details landed like bullet points in a story I never expected to hear. The man she'd left me for had fathered her child, then thrown in a mix of cheating and violence before walking out completely. No slow fade, no sugarcoating, just gone. The version of him she once defended to me had turned into something far worse than I'd imagined. By the time that chapter closed for her, she was alone, raising the baby without help from him or any real financial cushion. Work was inconsistent. Rent in her area had climbed beyond what she could manage. The only fallback she'd been able to secure wasn't an apartment or even a room, it was her aunt's garage. From what little I was told, it wasn't a converted space or anything meant for long-term living. There was a bed, a dresser, some of her child's toys, and one narrow path where you could walk without tripping over something. The picture that stuck with me was of a bare bulb swinging slightly from its cord, the kind of light you notice more for the shadows it throws than the warmth it gives. In the middle of winter, keeping the chill out would be a losing battle, and in summer, the air inside would get heavy fast. None of that made me want to gloat. I've known people, good people, who have gone through worse. Losing your independence and ending up in a borrowed corner of someone else's home is humbling in a way I wouldn't wish on anyone. Whatever history we had, it was obvious her life had narrowed in ways she hadn't planned. Meanwhile, my own life by that point had nothing in common with hers. Between the business sale and the accident settlement, I had more stability than I'd ever known. My home was mine outright. My expenses were covered months in advance. If something broke, I could fix it without wondering which bill I'd be late on to make it happen. The contrast between us was sharp enough that it felt almost staged, like some invisible hand had picked 2 points on a chart and pulled them in opposite directions. It didn't feel like triumph, it felt like a kind of symmetry no one could plan. Years earlier, she decided I wasn't enough, left for someone she decided was more, and now was dealing with the fallout of that choice in ways I wouldn't have predicted. I didn't see it as karma in a cosmic sense so much as a chain reaction. She made choices, he'd made his, and here were the results playing out. From anyone looking at it from the outside, it would have been hard to ignore the reversal. The person who'd left me for better prospects had ended up in a garage without those prospects. The person she'd written off had more security than ever. If she ever did hear about where I'd landed, she might have to revise whatever story she'd been telling about me all these years. I didn't go looking for more information. The outline I had told me enough. She was a single mother, living in a space built for storage, relying on family goodwill to get by. That was her reality now, and I wanted no part in altering or managing it. We were long past the stage where my help would have been natural, let alone welcome. Another time, I might have offered something, not because it would have been deserved, but because I used to have a problem with leaving people to fend entirely for themselves. Back then, I was slower to draw the line between helping and stepping back. Now I understood that line all too well. Whatever was happening in her life wasn't mine to steady. The only role I had in that story anymore was the one she'd left me with, which was to stay out of it completely. The bare facts of her situation were enough to remind me how differently the last few years had unfolded for each of us. I'd endured my own kind of collapse after the crash but had resources to rebuild. She'd encountered hers through the person she'd chosen, and the safety net just wasn't there. Two very different causes, two very different outcomes. I can admit, there was a part of me that noted the timing like you'd notice the neatness of a coincidence, how our lives had shifted in opposite directions without either of us being able to see it coming. But instead of anger or smugness, what I felt most was distance. Her struggle belonged entirely to her. My stability belonged entirely to me. That distance was the thing I valued most. No obligations, no ties, no blurred boundaries. But hearing about where she'd ended up made me realize something else. Just because I saw the separation clearly didn't mean everyone around me would. There's a gap between knowing someone's history and watching them go through hardship in the present. That gap was about to show itself in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't anticipating any debate, any second guessing of how I'd handled things since she left. But bringing up her situation at all, even in passing, turned out to be enough to put that gap front and center. And the reaction would come from people I thought knew better. The friendship jury. It started as a simple post-dinner hangout, just a few of us sitting around, letting conversation wander. At some point, someone asked if I'd heard from my ex lately. I said no, not directly, but I'd picked up enough through others to know the broad strokes. Without thinking too much about it, I mentioned I was finally in a position to move the divorce forward and that she wouldn't see a cent. I thought it was just a passing remark. Instead, it turned into a round-table debate I hadn't signed up for. One friend jumped in first. "You should help, she's got a baby now." I kept my tone even. "That's not my child and we've been apart for years. She has to handle what came from her own choices." Another followed right on their heels. "But you're still married technically." "On paper, yeah," I said, "but in reality, she ended that marriage the day she walked out for him. The paperwork lag doesn't change the truth." Then came the closer from across the table. "It wouldn't even hurt you financially." "That's not the point," I replied. Not wanting to give her money is enough of a reason, especially when the history looks like ours. What caught me off guard wasn't that they had opinions, but how sure they were of them. None of them had lived through what happened. They'd never seen the night I came home to find her with someone else in my own living room, never had to chase down signed papers for years while she played for time. They only knew an outline stripped of the sharp edges. The blanks they'd filled in with their own version, a softer, imagined story with me in the role of reluctant savior. Someone leaned forward, eyes a little too earnest. But think about her kid, maybe the kid doesn't deserve to go without. I said I did think about that, but that it didn't make her my responsibility. Every kid deserves stability, I told them, but you can't force it by throwing money at a parent who's already shown they'll burn a bridge if it benefits them. That line didn't win anyone over, but it ended that particular point. The conversation shifted to tone instead of substance, into ideas about second chances and rewriting endings. I could almost picture the movie they were scripting. Distant ex returns at just the right moment, offers help, and somehow everyone feels redeemed. I asked, would any of you give thousands to someone who lied to you, cheated on you, and dragged out a divorce for years? The silence after was long enough to make the point by itself. Of course they wouldn't. But that didn't stop them from circling back, because debating it cost them nothing. Still, one of them said, you're in a good place now. So are plenty of people, I replied. That doesn't mean they're obligated to clean up the consequences of someone else's life. At that, the energy around the table dipped a little, like the air was slowly leaving their case. Still, at least one person clung to the idea. I just think it would look good if you did. And that, I realized, was the heart of it. To them, this was about optics, how the gesture would feel from the outside, stripped of context. It wasn't about her as a person or me as a person, it was about a story they could tell themselves about fairness. I didn't bother giving a full breakdown, but I hit a couple of the main points. How she'd moved straight from me to the guy I'd been helping, how she'd refused to sign, how our contact wasn't emotional but logistical at best. From a distance, her story might look simple. Up close, it was anything but. When the discussion finally wound down, I knew nothing I said had shifted their view completely. Not helping her looked bad to them because they'd decided she was the underdog worth rooting for. They hadn't lived the early chapters, they were judging the ending in isolation. I left it there. They could keep their neatly packaged moral version. I had the one I'd lived through. And it got me thinking, not about whether I'd change my mind, but about how quick people are to assign obligations based on a snapshot, even when law, history, and common sense all point in the other direction. The way I saw it, this wasn't just about refusing to pay her bills. It was about having every right, legal and otherwise, to keep that boundary in place. And the truth of that would become even clearer when the next piece of the picture came into focus. Would you help your cheating ex if they were living in a garage with their kid? Because the way my side of the facts lined up, the answer for me was already decided. Legal loopholes and lemonade. When the topic shifted to her legal standing, it became clear to me how differently reality looked compared to the assumption floating around my friend group. A few of them seemed convinced that if I had money, she could somehow claim it, or at least that she should. But my lawyer made it very clear. The personal injury settlement I received after we'd been separated for years was not considered marital property in my state. Legally, she couldn't claim a cent of it. Hearing that was like finally getting a firm answer in a process that had been nothing but uncertainty. No loopholes, no gray areas. My lawyer even called it one of the rare spots in family law where there's no room for debate. We'd gone through the details together, so I understood the basis. The settlement existed to compensate for my injuries, my lost wages, and the long-term physical impacts I'd carry forward. None of that had anything to do with her. She wasn't part of my life when the accident happened, let alone part of the loss. The law saw that clearly, and for once, I didn't have to fight to make the facts match reality. Compared to all the drawn-out drama over divorce papers and delay tactics, this was refreshingly simple. Every other legal step with her had been bogged down with sidestepping and excuses, but this was straightforward. It was almost jarring to get a clean legal call that didn't require multiple follow-ups. The answer was final before the conversation even ended. And the impact went beyond just knowing she couldn't get at the money. It lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For years, part of the hesitation in forcing the divorce had been the fear that she'd use the process to take something I'd worked for. I'd heard enough stories of people losing assets they built after separation simply because the paperwork hadn't been finalized. Now that risk was gone. I didn't have to worry about rushing the process and paying the price for it later. The settlement was mine to manage without any unexpected claims showing up down the line. From a practical standpoint, it meant the final stretch could be handled on my terms. There was no need to calculate what I might lose by closing it out now, no hidden gamble buried in the fine print. This wasn't about beating her at a game, if anything, it was about finally stepping off the board entirely. Serving the papers now would be the last piece in removing her from my legal and financial world. Of course, the clarity didn't mean the outside commentary stopped. Friends who thought I should help her out didn't care about the legality. They viewed it entirely through the lens of emotional obligation. Some of them barely acknowledged that the law had settled the matter before they circled back to the same moral argument. But in my mind, the legal boundary mattered most, not because I was hiding behind it, but because it matched exactly where I'd already drawn the personal boundary. It also underscored an irony I hadn't missed. She kept dodging the divorce, maybe thinking the delay was keeping some form of leverage alive. Maybe she pictured a scenario where if I came into something big while we were still married on paper, she'd be in a position to benefit. Here was that scenario, except the rules cut her out entirely. Holding on for leverage had only kept her legally tied to something she couldn't access, standing outside a locked door she'd never get through. That realization made reading through the divorce filing this time very different from the past attempts. There was no tense calculation about whether I was opening myself up to a financial hit. The numbers were safe. The law was clear. The only thing left was the procedural step: serve the documents, collect the signatures if they came, and close the file. It also shifted my perspective on the entire concept of financial security. Before, any discussion about money in connection to her had come with a defensive edge because there was always the underlying threat that she might find a way to claim some piece of it. Now, there was no defensive energy needed. The security was real, both in my bank account and in the legal framework around it. Knowing I didn't have to share, and more importantly, knowing there was no opening in which I could be forced to, made conversations with my friends a lot easier to keep in perspective. Their objections weren't going to persuade me because they weren't rooted in facts, they were rooted in their own ideas of what generosity should look like. And while everyone's entitled to an opinion isn't the same thing as a claim. I'd seen plenty of situations where people gave too much to an ex, whether out of guilt, nostalgia, or pressure from the people around them. I didn't have to guess at the outcome: burnout, resentment, and a delayed ability to move on. This settlement, combined with the clarity from my lawyer, let me sidestep all of that entirely. I could keep moving forward knowing the last major tie between us wouldn't cost me anything more than the stamp on an envelope. It wasn't lost on me that this came from a situation I never would have chosen. The accident had been a pivot point I didn't ask for, but the same event that had ended my career also gave me the means to secure the separation I'd been trying to finish for years. It wasn't about winning. It was about finally reaching a version of events where the practical and the personal were aligned. There's a certain kind of relief in something being settled beyond argument. It removes the space for second-guessing or what-if scenarios. After sitting with the knowledge for a few weeks, I realized that this was more than just a legal point. It was a reminder that I could make decisions from a place of stability instead of reaction. That stability alone was worth protecting. And in a way, it made me look differently at the other areas of my life where conflict was still circling. The friends who kept pushing the angle that I should give her something, those conversations suddenly felt less like debates and more like noise. I understood my position completely now. I didn't need to explain it over and over to people who were determined to see it differently. That's when it began to click for me. Not every discussion is worth having, and not every opinion carries weight just because it's voiced in a room you're sitting in. Holding my ground here had nothing to do with stubbornness. It had everything to do with protecting the clear line I'd fought for, both legally and personally. With that in place, the decision about my next steps wasn't tangled anymore. The law had spoken. My boundaries were set, and if the people around me couldn't accept either, maybe it was time to reconsider which rooms I was choosing to sit in at all. Final cut with the friendship band. After that conversation, I started looking at a few friendships differently. It wasn't a blow-up or a dramatic unfriending. It was just me clocking who had shown me that my boundaries were negotiable in their minds. Most of the time, these were people I could grab a drink with, watch a game alongside, or trade jokes with. But when the topic touched my ex, it felt like the table turned into a panel making decisions about my life. I gave it a few days to see if it would pass. Sometimes people say things without thinking, then move on. But the next time we were together, one of them leaned in and asked if I'd thought about what we talked about, like they were checking in on whether I'd done my assigned reading. That question told me this wasn't just idle conversation, it was follow-up on a task they assumed I owed them progress on. I told them I hadn't changed my mind and wasn't going to. No rehashing the couch story, no diving back into history, they already knew it. They just didn't like my conclusion, so I said, if you feel that strongly you can all chip in yourselves, I'll give you her aunt's address. The room went quiet except for a couple of awkward laughs. Predictably, not one of them reached for their wallet. That was the moment I knew I needed more distance. This wasn't about winning an argument or forcing them to agree. It was about seeing how they treated a very clear decision I'd made, one rooted in both common sense and self-preservation, and realizing they didn't respect it. I'd spent years rebuilding the emotional walls I needed to stay healthy and forward-focused, and letting them keep chipping away at those to make space for someone who'd burned me would have undone that work. Protecting those boundaries mattered more than keeping every friendship intact. From that point, my approach shifted. I stopped saying yes to every group invite, especially if I could tell it would be the same faces pushing the same line. I didn't make an announcement about it. I just put more time into friends who treated no as the end of a conversation, not the start of a persuasion campaign. The quieter ones who simply listened that night, those relationships stayed. None of them brought her up again once they knew the basics. That space, I noticed how much lighter my social life felt. There were no sly comments when I mentioned a purchase, no insinuations that any good news in my life should include her. Without that constant undercurrent, I could actually enjoy the company. And in its place, I found a sharper instinct for who brings value into my life and who brings opinions disguised as advice. Conversation shifted back to what was in front of us instead of digging up someone I'd left behind years ago. Some people might see pulling back over one topic as excessive. This wasn't just about my ex, it was about how my boundaries were received on anything that mattered. If someone could dismiss them here on something as straightforward as not giving money to the person who lied, cheated, and stalled my divorce for years, why expect them to honor smaller boundaries? That seed of doubt changes how you see their presence in your life. The money part amplified it. When money's involved, people reveal whether they think you truly own the right to decide how yours is used. That dinner showed me at least some of them didn't think I did. If I gave in here, it would signal that with enough pressure, they could make calls over parts of my life that don't belong to them. That's not a precedent I'm ever interested in setting. Distance also closes off the drip feed of second guessing. Even someone confident in a decision can start questioning it if the same argument gets repeated often enough. A gap in contact means their version of the story doesn't get space to marinate in your head. Mine stayed clear. She made her choices, and those choices came with consequences she has to own. Difficulty doesn't erase the actions that led there. And it isn't my role to make people feel good about how I apply my values. I don't co-sign the idea that my finances or my energy should be open for community revision. Friends can have opinions and I can have mine. What matters is whether mine stand without being worn down to keep the peace. Over time, the distance became easy to maintain. Some connections will probably fade completely, and I'm fine with that. I'd rather focus on the people who take my no at face value. If those in the old group still feel strongly about helping her, they're free to act on it with their own money and time. I've made my position clear, and acting on hers or their expectations isn't part of my life anymore. The trade-off has been worth it. Fewer repetitive debates, less irritation building where enjoyment should be, and more hours with people who aren't trying to recast me in a story I didn't sign up for. Boundaries don't always require dramatic exits. Sometimes they're just a matter of not showing up where you know they won't be respected. In this case, it means stepping out of conversations framed as moral tests and keeping my focus on the life I've worked to rebuild without reopening old wounds. If your friends pressured you to rewrite your boundaries, how far would you go? It was clear to me, the circle I kept would match the life I wanted to protect. And with that settled in my mind, I could turn my attention to the one last piece still connecting us on paper, a piece that would finally close the book for good once I addressed it. Where the papers land. With the legal position settled, the next hurdle was just getting the papers into her hands. On paper, that's an easy step. In reality, figuring out where to deliver them was its own smaller battle. She was living in a converted garage at her aunt's place, except you couldn't find it in any public directory. No lease in her name, no utility accounts, nothing you could point to on an official record. It was like trying to send certified mail to a location that didn't officially exist. The garage setup wasn't something that popped up on online maps. To the outside world, it was just a regular backyard with a storage space tucked at one end. From what I learned, she'd been off the grid in this way for years. No bills, no mailing address, nothing that committed her to a place she could be held accountable for. Friends who still had some loose contact gave the same vague answer. She's with her aunt right now. But when I asked for an address, the response was either I don't know or a quick change of subject. I couldn't tell if they genuinely didn't have it or just didn't want to be in the middle. My lawyer explained that without a confirmed address, the normal process stalled. Near a park or back entrance facing an alley wasn't going to cut it with the court. We needed something concrete. That's when he suggested pulling in a process server, a professional whose whole job is tracking someone down and physically handing them court paperwork. They're good at what they do, but even they need a starting point. An unmarked garage behind another person's house wasn't ideal. Each lead I found fizzled out. One tip led us to a street that matched the description, but the property was a regular one-car garage that definitely wasn't being lived in. Another address turned out to be a clerical error, close in name but in an entirely different neighborhood. I wasn't chasing her across the country, she hadn't left town. The complication was that her life was anchored in this shadow space, adjacent to the system but not in it. The process server floated the idea of a stakeout once we narrowed things to a possible block. That meant sitting in a car, watching until she came or went, and approaching her directly to confirm her identity before delivering the papers. It sounded over the top for what was supposed to be a simple civil procedure, but it made sense. We couldn't risk giving her away to claim she'd never been contacted. If that failed, my lawyer said we could move to divorce by publication, asking the court for permission to post a legal notice in a newspaper when the other party can't be located. It's not as quick, but after a set period, the divorce can be finalized without their cooperation. We agreed to hold that in reserve while the process server kept working leads. Knowing there was a backup plan changed my mindset. Even if she stayed unreachable in that garage, the finish line was still there. Weeks blurred into each other while my lawyer's office ran searches and sent out quiet inquiries. Property records, voter registration checks, postal forwarding databases, all empty. In a way, it cemented that the only thing keeping this tie intact was the difficulty of physically placing an envelope in her hands. She wasn't shielding anything of value from me. She wasn't maneuvering for an advantage. It was just the reality of her living in a spot designed for storage, not residency. The irony didn't get lost on me. Years earlier, she'd avoided signing as if holding out gave her control. Now, what kept the marriage hanging on wasn't leverage, it was logistical obscurity. She built her life in a corner hard to find, and those same circumstances were dragging this into extra time. I'd catch myself imagining what the actual moment would look like from both sides. On her end, maybe a quiet afternoon, her child playing in the background when a knock comes at the garage door. She opens it to see someone she doesn't know ask if she's who they think she is. When she says yes, an envelope changes hands, that's it. No scene, no argument, just a transaction that takes less than a minute before the door closes again. On my side, it would mean a call from my lawyer confirming delivery, followed by the slow, procedural clock of the court running its course until the signature from a judge made it final. Years of buildup resolved in the space of a signature and a case file moving from one desk to another. Quiet, simple, unremarkable, exactly the ending I wanted. That plainness became easier to welcome than I expected. After everything that surrounded the original collapse, shocks, arguments, half-explanations, dragging refusals, there was some relief in the idea that the conclusion wouldn't be another flashpoint. It was a piece of business being handled the way all good endings should be, cleanly, without room to revisit. Even the process of finding her had lost its sting. It felt procedural, not personal. Each step was just a task on a list. Verify a street name, confirm a sighting, pass the details to the process server. Nothing argumentative, nothing to untangle emotionally, just the last actions needed to close it out. When the image of that garage door became the natural endpoint in my head, I started to think less about how ridiculous the search had been and more about what came after. Once those papers were delivered, whether by her answering the knock herself or through the line in a newspaper, my name and hers would finally be separated in every official way. No more documents joining us. No more explaining the technically still married clause if it ever came up. No possibility, legal or otherwise, for her to push her way back into my affairs. That's not the kind of ending anyone dreams about when they picture their life years ahead, but it's the one I ended up with. No applause, no bookend conversation, just a piece of mail or a knock at a door and then the slow fade of silence. And as much as it lacked drama, I realized that was the part that mattered most. It was a finish that didn't invite one more round of questions or pushback. Once the last paper landed where it needed to, there wouldn't be anything left for either of us to debate. That kind of closure might not be exciting to watch from the outside, but from where I stood, it was more than enough. From there, all that was left was stepping back and keeping my focus on the life I'd built in her absence. That meant holding to the same principles I'd leaned on since she left, ones that had kept me upright when everyone seemed to have an opinion about what I should do with my time, my energy, and my money. Principles that, by now, I knew I wasn't going to abandon. Legal clarity made one thing simple. My settlement wasn't marital property, so there was no obligation to share it. Personal clarity made the other point just as solid. Stepping back wasn't about money, it was about keeping distance from a dynamic that was toxic when I lived it. Boundaries aren't just about your bank account, they're about protecting the life you built after leaving something destructive. When you reopen that door, you risk more than finances. I want to hear what you think. Would you have helped your ex in this situation? Why or why not? Drop it in the comments, and if you liked this story, like and subscribe for more. I'll sign off the same way I left the marriage, quietly and without a dime changing hands.